Settle in, for we have a story that begins the way so many hard stories begin, with a girl standing at the edge of a road with nowhere particular to walk to. At 16 years old, Clementine Ashby owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a small tin box of coins, and a grief so fresh it still had the smell of turned earth clinging to it. It was her uncle, Silas Ashby, who cast her out, not with violence, but with the cold, practiced cruelty of a man reading a legal document aloud, informing her that her father's land, by the laws of inheritance in the Wyoming Territory of 1888, passed only to male kin, and that she, being neither son nor wife nor anyone the law recognized, had no further claim to the house she had been born in. She left with $27, saved coin by coin from selling preserves at the county fair, and with that money, she did something every soul in Harlow's Crossing would later call foolish. She bought, for $14, a rusting, half-collapsed water tower standing abandoned beside a stretch of railroad track the trains no longer used. It leaned like an old man in a windstorm, its wood gray and split, its tank silent for over a decade. No one could have guessed that sealed inside that forgotten tank was a letter that had never reached the hands it was written for, a letter that would, in time, restore not only Clementine's own fortune, but the very water that kept an entire town alive. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clementine Ashby. If you are watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or written off by the people who were supposed to protect it, tell us in the comments. We would love to hear where you are joining us from tonight. Clementine had been raised on Ashby land, a modest but well-loved homestead 2 miles outside the town of Harlow's Crossing, where her father, Thomas Ashby, had built a life out of wheat, orchard trees, and an unshakable belief that a person's worth was measured by what they gave to their neighbors rather than what they hoarded for themselves. Her mother had died of a fever when Clementine was 7, and so it had been Thomas who raised her, teaching her to read from the one shelf of books he owned, to keep account books with a steady hand, and, most importantly, to listen, really listen, to the land and the people around her, because he believed both told the truth if you were patient enough to hear it. Thomas Ashby was not a wealthy man, but he was known throughout the county for a peculiar kind of generosity. During the drought summer of 1881, when 3 families nearly lost their crops, it had been Thomas who quietly dug an extra well and shared its water without asking for a cent in return. He used to tell Clementine, while she helped him repair fence posts or count seed, that water was the one thing in this world that was never meant to belong to a single man, because it fell from the sky onto everyone's roof alike, and it ran beneath everyone's feet alike, and any fool who tried to fence it off from his neighbors was fencing off his own soul from decency. Clementine absorbed these words the way dry soil absorbs rain, completely, and without ever quite forgetting where they had come from. She grew up capable in ways that surprised people who expected a farmer's daughter to be delicate. She could read a ledger faster than the schoolteacher, could set a broken axle, could calm a spooked horse with nothing but a low, even voice, and could recognize, from the color and clarity of well water, whether a spring beneath it was clean or beginning to sour. Her father used to joke that she had a diviner's instinct without ever needing a forked stick to prove it. It was a skill she came by honestly, for Thomas Ashby had spent years walking the land with the county surveyor and the old railroad engineers who had passed through in the early 70s, learning where the underground water moved, which hills had springs, and which dry gullies were deceiving. He passed all of this knowledge to his daughter not because he expected her to need it, but because he believed a person should understand the ground beneath her feet, whatever her future held. Neither of them could have imagined how much that inherited understanding would matter one day, nor how directly it would return to save her. Her uncle Silas, Thomas's younger brother, had never shared any of this reverence for water or land or neighbor. Silas had left Harlow's Crossing as a young man to chase mining fortunes in Montana, returning 15 years later with a hardened face, a taste for other men's leverage, and very little patience for his brother's idealism. He arrived back in the territory only months before Thomas's sudden death from a fall during a barn repair, and it was Silas, smooth-talking, legally literate in the way only a man who has spent years around claim offices can be, who produced the paperwork proving that under territorial law, since Thomas had left no will explicitly naming Clementine, and since she was female and unmarried, The land defaulted to the nearest male relation. The county judge, a tired man uninterested in a fight, upheld it without much scrutiny. Clementine was given 2 weeks to gather her things. The 2 weeks passed in a haze of disbelief, as she tried every avenue a 16-year-old girl in 1888 had available to her. She wrote to a cousin in Cheyenne who never answered. She asked the schoolteacher, Miss Pruitt, if there was any legal recourse, and was told gently that there was not, and she stood in the very kitchen where her mother had once hummed hymns while kneading bread, trying to memorize the smell of the wood stove before it, too, belonged to someone else. On the final morning, Silas stood on the porch steps with his arms crossed, not even meeting her eyes as she walked past him with her single carpetbag, and said only that he hoped she'd find sense somewhere else. Since there was none to be found sitting on land she had no legal claim to. She did not answer him. She had already decided, somewhere deep in the walk down that dirt road, that she would rather carry silence than give him the satisfaction of her tears. She took a room above the mercantile in town for a few nights, paying with coins she had saved from selling preserves and quilts at the county fair, a total of $27, which was, in the plainest terms, everything she had left in the world. She spent those first days doing what any sensible person does when the ground has been pulled out from under them. She walked. She walked the length of Harlow's Crossing, past the church, past the blacksmith, past the dry goods store, out toward the old railroad spur where a line had once run supplies through before the railroad company rerouted its main track 11 miles south in 1879, leaving behind a rusting siding, a collapsed depot, and a wooden water tower that had once filled steam locomotives before they thundered onward toward the Pacific. The tower had not held water in 9 years. Its legs were gray and splintered, one of them visibly leaning, its tank ringed with rust the color of dried blood, and its access ladder missing several rungs entirely. Weeds had grown thick around its base, and local boys dared each other to climb it, and always lost their nerve halfway up. It was, by every measure a sensible person might apply, worthless. And yet Clementine found herself standing beneath it for the better part of an hour, staring up at its silhouette against the pale Wyoming sky, remembering, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, the way her father used to speak of towers like this one, structures built not merely to hold water, but to mark a place where water had once been found, trusted, and shared. When she learned from the station master's widow, who still lived in the small caretaker's cottage nearby, that the railroad company considered the entire abandoned spur, tower included, a liability rather than an asset, and would sell the parcel to anyone willing to take responsibility for its eventual demolition, Clementine did not hesitate the way a wiser person might have. She offered every dollar she believed the transaction was worth. $14. It was, by any account, an act of foolishness, a homeless girl spending more than half of her entire fortune on a collapsing tower nobody else wanted, on a strip of land nobody else would claim. The widow, a kind woman named Odalise Ferris, signed the paper without asking many questions, mostly out of pity, and handed Clementine a rusted key to a padlock that, as it turned out, no longer even had a matching lock to open. That first night, sleeping in the small abandoned depot building beside her new and utterly impractical property, Clementine told herself it was simply shelter. 4 walls and a roof were 4 walls and a roof, whatever stood beside them. But something in her would not let the tower alone. The following morning, with the stubbornness her father had so often praised in her, she began to climb it, testing each rung before trusting her weight to it, until she reached the small maintenance hatch at the top of the tank. It took her the better part of an afternoon to pry it loose, rust flaking into her hair and beneath her fingernails, and when it finally gave way with a groan, she found the tank's interior dry, dust-choked, and strangely undisturbed, as though no one had opened it in a very long time. Wedged into a gap between 2 interior support beams, protected from 9 years of weather by a scrap of oilcloth tied with twine, was a small bundle of papers. Her hands trembled as she untied the twine. Inside was a single sealed envelope, yellowed but intact, addressed in a careful, old-fashioned hand to the town council of Harlow's Crossing, and beneath the address, in smaller letters, a note that read, "To be opened only if the spring beneath the depot tower is ever disputed." Clementine sat with that envelope for a long while before she found the courage to open it, some instinct telling her that whatever it held mattered more than curiosity alone could justify. When she finally broke the seal, she found a letter dated the 11th of April, 1874, written by a man named Ezra Lindqvist, the railroad's own hydraulic engineer, the man who had originally surveyed and built the very tower she now sat inside of. The letter explained, in Lindqvist's precise and careful prose, that the water feeding the depot tower did not come from any well the railroad had dug, but from a natural spring beneath what was then Ashby land, Clementine's own family's land. A spring so reliable and so pure that Lindqvist had diverted a portion of it, with the blessing and full agreement of the town's founding families, to fill the steam engines passing through. In exchange, Lindqvist had written a binding agreement, witnessed and signed by the founding council, that the spring itself, wherever its water surfaced or was later claimed, would remain a shared resource belonging to the town in common, never to be privately fenced or sold, so long as Harlow's Crossing stood. He explained that he had intended to personally deliver a copy of this agreement to the town council chambers, but had been abruptly reassigned by the railroad company before he could do so, and that he was leaving the original document sealed in the one place he trusted it would remain untouched until it was needed, inside the tank of the very tower the spring had once filled. He signed it with an apology for the inconvenience of an undelivered letter, and a hope that it would never need to be read at all, because that would mean the water had never been threatened. Clementine read the letter 3 times before she understood the full weight of what she was holding. She thought of her father's words about water belonging to no single man, and she thought, with a chill crawling up the back of her neck, of the well her Uncle Silas had begun expanding on the old Ashby land not 2 months after taking it. The same well, she now realized with dawning certainty, that fed from this very spring. In the weeks that followed, Clementine kept the letter close, sewn into the lining of her coat, while she pieced together exactly what had happened in Harlow's Crossing during the years she had been too young to notice. Silas, upon inheriting the land, had wasted no time turning his brother's modest well into something far larger, fencing off nearly 2 acres around it under the pretense of protecting livestock, and then, with the quiet cooperation of a county water commissioner he had befriended over cards, filing a claim declaring the well and its underground source his private property. From that well, Silas began selling water rights to nearby homesteaders at prices that crept steadily upward each season, particularly once a dry summer in 1889 left half the county's shallow wells sputtering and cracked. Families who had once drawn freely from communal streams now found themselves paying Silas Ashby a monthly fee simply to keep their cattle alive, and those who could not pay were forced to haul water for miles from the river, a task that broke backs and, in at least one case that Clementine heard whispered about at the Mercantile, broke a family entirely, sending them west in search of easier ground. She understood, holding Lindqvist's letter, that she possessed something far larger than a simple curiosity from an abandoned tower. She possessed proof that the spring Silas now charged the entire town to drink from had never been his to claim at all, that it belonged, by a founding agreement older than his ownership of the land itself, to the whole community in common. But she also understood, with the caution her father had raised her to have, that possessing proof and being believed were 2 very different things, especially for a 16-year-old girl with no legal standing, no money, and a family name that Silas had spent a year quietly souring in town gossip, hinting that his brother's daughter was unstable, ungrateful, prone to fanciful stories. She spent the better part of a month verifying what she could, walking the 11 miles into the county seat to search old land office records, where a sympathetic clerk named Horace Bell, who had known her father, allowed her to examine ledgers most people never bothered requesting. There, buried in a box of documents nobody had touched in over a decade, she found the original founding charter of Harlow's Crossing, dated 1871, and within it, exactly as Lindqvist's letter described, a clause reserving all natural springs discovered within town boundaries as common property held in trust for all settlers, never to be individually deeded. She copied the clause carefully into her own notebook, her hands steady now in a way they had not been that first night atop the tower, because steadiness, she had come to believe, was the only weapon a person without money or standing truly had. When she returned to Harlow's Crossing and began, quietly at first, mentioning what she had found to a few trusted neighbors, the Hendricksons, whose cattle had nearly died the summer prior for want of affordable water, and Odalise Ferris, who remembered Ezra Lindqvist fondly from his years working the depot. Word moved through the town faster than she expected, and not entirely to her benefit. Silas Ashby, hearing that his niece was making claims about the water he had spent 2 years building a fortune from, did not respond with panic, but with the cold calculation of a man who had faced down claim disputes before. He went first to the town council, framing Clementine's discovery as the desperate fabrication of a bitter girl who had lost her inheritance and now sought to punish him out of spite, suggesting that any document she claimed to have found was likely forged or, at best, misunderstood. He reminded the council, not without menace, that several of its members currently purchased water from his well at a discounted rate as a courtesy he could easily rescind should anyone choose to make an enemy of him. The council, populated largely by men who owed Silas either money or water access, was reluctant to act. Reverend Calloway, who chaired the meetings, told Clementine with evident discomfort that without a notarized verification of the letter's authenticity, and without Ezra Lindqvist himself alive to testify, for the old engineer had, as far as anyone knew, passed away years earlier somewhere in Nebraska, the council could not simply overturn a legally filed water claim on the word of a girl and a 14-year-old letter pulled from a rusted tank. Clementine left that meeting with her jaw tight and her eyes dry, though it took every ounce of her father's stubbornness to keep them that way, and she understood, walking back toward her tower in the fading light, that Silas intended to bury this the same way the letter itself had been buried, quietly, and for as long as it took for everyone to simply forget. But Clementine had inherited more than stubbornness from her father. She had inherited his patience, and his instinct that the truth, properly tended, tends eventually to surface on its own. She wrote first to the railroad company's regional office, explaining that she possessed original correspondence from their former engineer Ezra Lindqvist regarding water infrastructure the company had once maintained, and asked, plainly, whether any company records might confirm the agreement he described. It took 6 weeks for a reply to arrive, but when it did, it came from a company clerk who had located Lindqvist's original survey reports from 1874, which referenced, in dry bureaucratic language, an easement granted by the Ashby family and the town founders for shared spring access, corroborating precisely what the letter claimed. Armed now with 2 independent pieces of evidence, Clementine also managed, through a chain of letters and a stroke of good fortune, to locate Ezra Lindqvist himself, not deceased at all, but living in modest retirement in Lincoln, Nebraska, his eyesight failing but his memory sharp as ever. When she wrote to him describing the letter and the tower, an old man who had spent 14 years believing his careful work had simply been forgotten wept, by his own admission in the return letter, to learn that it had finally been found, and he agreed without hesitation to provide a sworn, notarized statement confirming every detail. Even with this evidence assembling steadily in her favor, Silas did not yield easily. He attempted, in the weeks before the matter could be brought formally before the county judge, to buy Clementine's silence outright, sending an intermediary to offer her $200, a fortune to a girl who had arrived in town with 27, in exchange for the letter and her agreement to say nothing further. It was, in its own way, the moment that revealed the true shape of the story, because Clementine, standing in the dust outside her tower with an offer that would have solved every material problem she had, understood in that instant precisely what her father had meant all those years, mending fences and speaking of water belonging to no one man. She refused the money, not out of pride, but because she understood that if she took it, the Hendricksons and every other family straining under Silas's fees would go on straining, and that some kinds of wealth, gained at the cost of a neighbor's thirst, curdled the moment they touched your hands. The matter came before Judge Colfax on a warm afternoon in early autumn, with half the town crowded into the small courthouse to watch, and it was Ezra Lindqvist's notarized statement, read aloud alongside the original founding charter and the sealed letter itself, that finally turned the room. The judge, a careful man who had little patience for having been misled, reviewed the documents for the better part of an hour in silence before ruling that the spring beneath the old Ashby land had never been, and could never legally become private property, and that any fees collected for its water since Silas's claim was filed were to be considered improperly gathered, with a formal accounting required. Silas Ashby's face, Clementine would remember for the rest of her life, did not show anger in that moment so much as a kind of hollow disbelief. The expression of a man watching a fortune he had assumed was simply his by cleverness dissolve in front of an entire town he had underestimated. The restoration that followed was not loud or triumphant so much as steady, the way water itself moves once a blockage is finally cleared. The spring was declared, once again, common ground. Its access opened without charge to every homestead within the town's boundary, exactly as Lindqvist and the founders had intended 60 years before. The Hendricksons, who had nearly lost their herd the summer prior, were among the first to lead their cattle back to water that no longer cost them a cent, and old Odalise Ferris, who had signed over the useless tower to Clementine out of simple pity, wept openly when the town council voted to restore and repair the depot property itself as a public well house, naming Clementine Ashby its official caretaker, a position that came with a modest salary and, more importantly, a home. Silas, stripped of the income his fraudulent claim had generated and facing a formal accounting the council demanded of every dollar he had collected, found himself owing more in restitution than he had ever managed to save, and within a year, he quietly sold what remained of the Ashby homestead and left the territory altogether, the way men often do when a town finally sees them clearly. Clementine did not celebrate his departure. She simply returned, at last, to the land her father had raised her on, not through any court's charity, but because the same council that had once hesitated to believe her now moved swiftly to see the original homestead deed corrected in her name, a wrong of inheritance law quietly righted by a community that had finally understood exactly what kind of woman they had almost let slip away. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began, with a 16-year-old girl standing on a dirt road with $27 and nowhere to walk to, cast out by an uncle who believed the law made him untouchable, spending more than half of everything she owned on a rusted, leaning water tower that everyone else in Harlow's Crossing considered worthless. What she found sealed inside that tank was never simply a letter, though it took the shape of one, yellowed and folded and tied with twine. It was a promise that a good man had made and never gotten to deliver, waiting patiently in the dark for someone with the patience to climb up and listen. Clementine Ashby did not restore the spring because she sought a fortune, and she did not fight her uncle because she wanted revenge. She did it because her father had taught her, in the quiet, unglamorous language of fence posts and shared wells, that some kinds of value are only invisible to people who have never learned to look for them. The tower others saw as scrap wood and rust, she saw as a keeper of a promise. The letter others might have dismissed as an old man's forgotten paperwork, she recognized as a debt owed not to herself, but to an entire community that had simply forgotten it was owed anything at all. And in restoring what had been buried, she restored, too, the version of herself that her uncle had tried to convince the world did not matter, proving, in the plainest and most lasting way a person can, that being overlooked and being worthless are never, in fact, the same thing. Thank you for spending this time with Clementine Ashby and the quiet town of Harlow's Crossing, and for letting this story sit with you a while, the way good stories should. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that value often hides in the places we've already written off. We'd love to know, what is a time you found worth in something others had thrown away, whether an object, a place, or even a person? Tell us below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay close.